The majority of the time when I want to manipulate my object, I'm going to be using these basic tools found on the left. And the four I'm going to focus on are the Select tool, and this is used for selecting objects, the Move tool, which is used for translating it in a different direction, Rotate tool, which is, as you might guess, used for rotating an object, and the Scale tool for changing its size. I also want to mention that if you hover over these, you'll see for some of these tools, the four I mentioned, they have a letter designation to them, Q, and this one has a W, Rotate has an E, and Scale has an R. Because this is going to be a lot simpler for you if you get used to using Q, W, E, and R to select those tools instead of having to come over here and select them. It just saves you a little bit of time. So let's start with the Select tool. I will cover it in another video how to select objects in general. So watch that to get a little bit more specific on selections. But in general, this is just going to choose which object I want to start manipulating and changing, whether I want to move the whole object itself or if I want to go down deeper and select its different individual components and edit it on a shape level. Okay. The Move tool is going to be this one right here, or the W key. And I'm going to go ahead and show you guys these manipulator handles. So this is called a manipulator. So I can drag it along one of these arrows, and that's going to be moving it in that particular direction. These directions line up with my world axes, which you can find right here. And also if you drop in the grid, it also lines up with the grid as well. Generally speaking, green is up and down, blue is forward and back, and red is left and right. And you can see these have a letter component, X, which is red, left and right, Y, which is up and down, and Z, which is forward and back. Okay, and so that's very handy to kind of get used to that nomenclature. Also, you'll notice that these might be a different shape on your computer versus my computer. You can change this appearance of the size of these manipulators by pressing the control or the plus and minus keys on your keyboard. So if you ever feel like it's too small or it's too big and you can't see it, just use those plus and minus keys to make it more comfortable for you. You also have this square in the middle, and this will be true for all of them. This is the freeform. And what this does is it just moves them in all three axes depending on your camera view. And so you can see it's just kind of moving it around my camera view in all three axes. It's not really worrying so much about moving in one particular direction. I generally don't do that. Like I feel like it's better to actually move it along an axis because it's a little bit cleaner, but if you need that, it's there. We also have these little planes, and what those mean is it means translate in two directions at once. So in this case, you can see this blue axis moving forward and back. If I click on this blue square and move it, it's going to be moving in those two highlighted axes, the Y and X axis, or the up and down and left and right. And so you'll notice that that blue, let me click on a different one so it's no longer highlighted. That blue means don't move it in the Z axis, move it in the X and Y axis. And you'll also notice this is in between the X and Y axis. So you might not know at first which ones do what, but you'll get used to them pretty quickly. And so being able to move it in two axes is really handy. So if I wanted to move this cube, let's say I'm going to sit it up on the floor, right? So let's pretend the grid is the floor. I want to stay on top of the grid, and I want to move it over here. I could move it and then move it, but more easily I could just click and drag this and then move it into place. And because I'm moving it in these two axes using this little plane icon, this plane manipulator icon, I'll know I'm not going to move it up and down. I'm only moving it forward, back, left, and right. So that's really handy because I can confidently move this around this floor, and I know it's not going to fall down the floor or lift up off the floor because I'm manipulating in only the forward, back, left, and right axes. Let's take a look at the Rotate tool. I'll bring this one down, make that a little bit smaller. So the Rotate tool is the exact same kind of concept. It is these different colored rings are associated with a different direction or axis. So in this case, the x-axis, you see this red ring is associated with the left and right. And if I go to the movement tool, you'll see the left and right is pointing this way, like left and right in this direction. But the rotational axis is actually circling that, right? It's rotating around that axis. So you'll see this is red, left and right. And now when I switch to this, imagine that circle is rotating around that axis. So those colors correspond to which axes you're going to turn around. Let's look at the channel box. We haven't looked at that yet. So you'll see any of these transform values, the move, rotation, scale are being recorded here. And so I can manipulate them in the 3D viewport or I can manipulate them up here. We'll come back to this in a second. but you'll see I can go ahead and rotate this in the x-axis, right? Z-axis and y-axis. And like I said, imagine that this rotation handle is corresponding to one of these three directions, right? So you see this y up and down. It's going to rotate, this green one right here is going to rotate around that y-axis. Okay, and notice how as I rotate it, it's changing these values right here. If I do the blue one, just like with the move tool, it's going to do a freeform based on my camera. I can also click inside right here. You see there's this inner circle that highlights a little bit. And what that's going to do is it's going to do a free tumble. And this one's kind of like, what it'll do is it'll lock onto the position that I have put my mouse on. So imagine like a 3D sphere, kind of like this, hovering over it. And I'm clicking on a point in the sphere. So I come in here. So I'm clicking on a point in the sphere and it's rotating my object so that my mouse and that point on that sphere are always kind of touching. So that is another way you can do like a freeform rotation. Again, kind of like the move tool, I'm not going to use this that often, and I'm not going to use this that often. The last one we're going to look at is the scale tool. So I'm just going to switch over to the scale tool or press R on my keyboard. And this one, just like the other ones, has axes assigned to it. So I can scale it in the x-axis by clicking on the red handle, or I can come up here to these plane axes, or plane manipulators, and I can scale it in 2 axes at once, right? Just like the translation tool. And just like the other 2 tools, I can click on this little blue icon in the middle and scale them all at the same time in this case. So this one's probably the most frequent that I'm going to use, this freeform scaling versus the freeform movement and the freeform rotation, because this one scales all 3 axes at the same time, which is very handy. It's very frequent that you'll want to scale up an object, but all of it at the same time and just make it bigger or smaller rather than stretching it in a particular direction. Over in the channel box, like I said before, is where I can also change the values. So instead of rotating this in the y-axis with the handles, right, I can come in here and type in a precise number. So let's say I want to rotate it 45 degrees in that axis, right? So I get this very precise angle to that by just typing it in. I can type in multiple at the same time. So let's go ahead and set that back to 0. Let's say I want to scale it up to 2 times the size. I can select, click and drag over these 3 attributes at the same time, and then end it right here on top of the actual number. And you'll see it's going to keep those highlighted and then highlight that number field. And then I can type in the number I want, press 2, press enter, and you'll see it updates everything I had selected at the same time with that new number. The default for everything is going to be, or for translate rotation is going to be 0. And the default for scale is going to be 1. You don't want to drop it down to 0 because it's scaling to nothing in that axis. And so that's usually not something you want. But you do frequently want to scale it down less than 1. That's pretty common. And I think I mentioned this earlier. I'm not sure if it's in the same video, but I can come in here and I can middle mouse click in the viewport with something selected, and it will actually update that in my viewport without me having to drag on a manipulator. So I can do it all 3 of them at the same time, or maybe just 2 of them, right? And it's kind of the same thing as if I was dragging or scaling in one of these little plane manipulators. I can also come in here and I can click and drag on the actual number itself, and it does kind of the same thing. Next, I want to take a look at the snapping options. So we're going to take a look at some of those options for these tool settings. Some of these things we'll cover in another video, but there's a few I want to cover right now. For both the translate, rotate, and scale tools, I have something called step snap. And so what this does is it will snap different increments for you. So it's not, you'll see, like, let's take a look at this. When I move my object with the move tool, you'll see it's kind of starting at the thousandths place and going forward. And it's a little bit hard to hit specific numbers, right? So if I'm trying to hit like 0.5, I have to be really careful, or I could come up here and just type in 0.5 if I really wanted to. Let's set that one to 0 as well. If I use step snap, that's a mouthful, and I'm going to say, let's say relative, right? You'll see now it's actually going to snap to that value, right? So I'm getting perfect full placement or whole number values here, and I'm getting that decimal number stuff, right? And I can change that increment. So let's say I want to do half my unit increments, right? So that's 0.5. And you'll see it's going to move and snap to 0.5 increments of movement. And I can turn that back off. The one I use it the most frequently with is the rotate tool. So often with the rotate tool, I want to get like 45-degree angle or 90-degree angle rotations. So let's say let's go ahead and scale this down to something like this. And I want to, let's say this is the object I have, and I want to stand it up straight on this end, right? I want to stand it up standing tall. So in order to do that, what I can do is I can rotate it up like this. The problem with this is it's doing it freeform with the handle is a little tough. I could come in here and I could, of course, type in 90, but sometimes, especially if you're working quickly, that can slow you down a little bit, having to come in here and type in values. So I can come in here and use the step snap and do relative, and you can see this one's 15 degrees, right? And so that's really great. So I know pretty confidently that I'm going to get very specific angles just at a glance by using this manipulator. But as always, it's easier if we can do this in as few steps as possible. So not having to come to the tool settings to turn this on and off will save us a lot of time. So something I like to do is a hotkey, or one of my favorite hotkeys is the J key. So the J key, you'll see right here, is going to turn on and off or toggle the step snap for your current tool. So if I hold J, it's going to change those or turn on that step snapping for 15 degrees. So this is something I'll frequently do, and you'll probably see me frequently in later videos use this hotkey to turn on step snapping.